Welcome back to Wisdom and Exile Radio. This week, we'll be discussing Disillusionment, Chapter 6 of Lama Jumper's book, Wisdom and Exile. All right. This podcast, this chapter, we'll be going over disillusionment, and it covers quite a lot of different things. One of them is how to find a good teacher, or how to recognize a shady teacher to avoid. And we'll be talking about concepts like disillusionment, disappointment, and
resentment
and credulity.
Yeah, I mean, I was going to say, I think part of it carries on from last episode, wasn't around conceit, and because there we were talking about how often people approaching Dharma, as Westerners as well, where Buddhism's so new, we have all these sort of assumptions about what Buddhism is, and we might have a quite superficial idea of what it is, and assume it agrees with most of our Western political and moral outlook that we already have. So one of the aspects we could touch on was around people come to Buddhism like that. They think it's like this, and they're all gung-ho, I'm into Buddhism, I'm a Buddhist. And then at some point they realize, oh shit, actually, this completely disagrees with one of my long-held deep opinions. And at that point they get disillusioned with Buddhism. And then I think what Lama Jampa's saying in the book is quite common then for people to then just give up the Dharma and sort of walk away from it.
It's okay. I'll learn to live without it.
So that sort of disillusionment becomes sort of resentment of, I was sold a pup, I thought Buddhism was this. For some reason, this teacher I've been following said, yeah, it's like this, and then I find out later it's not. So Buddhism isn't at all what I thought it was. I give it up.
He does mention that doesn't just come from people coming in with their preconceptions, but it is actually sometimes supported by teachers. They will accommodate these dogmas and these kind of predispositions that people come in and don't want to give up. And that's not just Western teachers. There's actually some Asian teachers who are more than happy to let you go along with something that's completely, antithetical to Buddhism, and they'll even tell you, yeah, that's Buddhism. Like, we don't need to list the normal controversial issues that we've already touched on. Everyone knows what they are. But
I mean, there's so many different versions or things that are being passed off as Buddhism these days that you can almost shop around and find the version that's going to just align with your worldviews, so that you can kind of pin your badge on without having to make any kind of radical changes or do any kind of self-reflection.
One thing you mentioned, which has always interested me, is, and this might just be me imagining a bit, but there's this line about, doesn't seem much room in the Western Buddhism for the unshowy man or woman with their dirty hands and their struggles. And I always think of working class people and the working classes and the poor when I read that line, because when you go to Western Dharma centers, you don't see working class people generally. And why is that? Yeah, it's not because they don't exist. And it's not also because that they don't have the capacity to practice Buddhism, right? Anyone who knows working class and poor people knows that there's actually a lot of intelligent, thoughtful people there. And certainly people who are in need and open to spiritual truth and meaning. So, the Buddhist centers in the West are very middle class, and I think perhaps somewhat unfriendly to working class and poor.
Maybe, but then the three of us got relatively working class background,
but I think we all sort of transformed into middle class through, went to university and got middle class jobs, and that was a difficult transition, to be fair, for me at least. I don't know, definitely difficult.
The funny thing is, I know what you mean in a way, but I can't help but think of our Manchester centre. There's quite a lot of working class people in our Manchester centre.
Well, I think there's a lot of reasons why working class people weren't out of recent history engaged with Buddhism, because it had that hippie connection with the counterculture back in the 60s. Like when I told my mom and other people, it wasn't uncommon to get a response like, oh, so, you know, you're a hippie, basically, you know, you're into Buddhism. And that's historically in England isn't a very working class outlook. You know, hippies were kind of frowned on. Oh yeah, just an idiot, or it was just a phase.
Yeah, I don't know either. And maybe it's not even actually true. Maybe it's more true in America. Anyway, I'm not even sure about that. But it ties in with the disillusionment thing, because I think working class, you know, life generally has a lot of necessary encounters with reality in it. The reality of physical, you know, declining physical strength, you know, you haven't got much money. Life is often hard, and you've got health problems often. You know, these kind of painful realities that don't leave room for the creating a Buddhism of projections and living with a Buddhism of projections.
I think I'm wondering, perhaps part of the answer to that question is that there's so much psychoanalysis has been tagged onto Buddhism. And you look at how Buddhism has flourished in other countries, in other cultures, Eastern cultures, and it is very popular with the working classes, because you don't have to have an intellectual understanding of Buddhism. You can just have faith in things like compassion. And obviously many Buddhists, most of the Buddhists, I would say, from those cultures are probably not even able to read. They're not literate. And so, you know, you don't have to be able to understand the Buddhist texts and have this intellectual understanding. You can just have faith in the Buddha. Whereas in the West, it's very much, Buddhism is very much about the philosophies and the intellectual grasping of those kind of things, if that makes sense. And maybe that's why there's that distinction between people who've had like a university education who can understand Buddhist philosophy versus working class people who might be, engaged with the compelling aspects of being compassionate, but are just pushed away by all of the headiness, all of the intellectual side of it.
I mean, there's something to that. It's an interesting topic, but like you say, like in there's another connection in the book here about why is it some people disillusionment when they find out a teacher's fake or they've been sold fake dharma, that isn't itself necessarily a problem. But to your point, what happens in the West is then people then turn against that teacher. So they've gone from being, you know, saint to sinner. They've gone from being some holier than thou person and suddenly realize actually they're just a crook, or they turn against the Dharma. Whereas, so I think part of that is in the West, isn't it? Because it's so new to us, we do come to it with this sort of more intellectual approach without much faith or whatever.
It's not faith, because those people will have a blind faith. It's not that. It's a lack of realism and common sense, I think, that leads to this following fake teachers and this projection of, you know, I want Buddhism to be this, and not being grounded in these kind of real problems that Buddhism is addressing around, you know, old age, sickness, death, suffering, true suffering.
Yeah, I think you're right. Maybe faith is the wrong term, but there's something having a supportive cultural background, isn't it? I think my mum, you know, brought up in Hong Kong, and her mother was very devout Buddhist, and she would pray every day to a shrine. She would fast, be vegetarian certain times a year. And my mum, although she didn't practice Buddhism for many years, when she came back to it, as it were, there's this sort of real solidity there. And you're right, there's less over projecting, isn't it, onto the teacher or whatever. There's something real about
that point about the community. I would suggest that is an antidote to individualism, the individualism of modern culture, where we talked about before on this podcast, where it's all about me. What's my thing? What's myself? And what are my brands and my my personality. And one thing is I'm a Buddhist, and so that makes me a bit special. Of course, you can't do that in a Buddhist culture. No one's special by being a Buddhist, but in the West you can. Makes you a bit special, a bit spiritual. Ooh, look at me.
You're special to me. You are the only one like you, my friend. I like you.
So I would say that's the difference there. It's individualism versus the cultural Buddhism that stops that kind of silliness.
Yeah, so as Buddhism's come to the West, we've seen these efforts to make it more palatable to Western ideology. And this chapter talks about being disillusioned when you discover that some of the people purporting to teach the Buddhist teachings are not. They're teaching something else that is very compelling. So, I mean, essentially fake teachers. Maybe we can talk a little bit about fake teachers.
Well, maybe we can talk about, I think there's two main buckets of fake teachers, isn't there? There's the sort of more secular bucket where you get, so many meditation teachers or life coaches or spiritual, but secular sort of spiritual guides. There's that bucket. And then there's the more ones that actually, I'm a Buddhist master and I'm a Buddhist teacher. And I guess you get fake in both sides. Well, when I was reading the chapter, I thought it's more about the, I am a real Buddhist teacher one. It seems to be more about that, because I sort of think if they're already it's sort of a bit of Buddhism and a bit of, how's your father or whatever. And then that sort of side of things more, that's sort of an expression, isn't it?
Probably is a bit of how's your father, to be fair. But I'm not sure that's what
there often is a bit of how's your father. But that side is a bit, I'm not sure if we've worth talking about that, because it's a bit like, because that's like the consumerist one, isn't it? Yeah, a bit of spirituality, I'll do a bit of meditation, a bit of spirituality, and after a few months or a year, that was quite cool, but this guy is a bit better, I'll do a bit of this one.
I mean, I like your two bucket approach. The dividing secular versus people who actually claim some affiliation to a traditional lineage, but are also a little bit shady. So I mean, it's important. Let's distinguish between those two. I mean, because secular Buddhism is pretty easy to identify, in so much as it tries to completely strip away any kind of religious or traditional aspect to it, and makes it much more of a form of like psychoanalysis or therapy. And you see that when big red flags are like when you get like guided meditation practices where instead of doing lojong, you inhale all of the good, the golden light, and you exhale all of the bad. So it's all about this, improving yourself, making the self happier.
Yeah, they're explicit about the fact that it's not transcendental. It's entirely immanent. Because like I've seen a lot of things on these meditation courses where it's like, here are the benefits. You can be more effective in your job. You might have better relationship with your family, and they try and do it sort of in a scientific way. Like we've measured the heart rate, and it can reduce blood pressure or something. And it's all very physicalistic
And I think we covered that pretty well in the chapter on conceit, the secular bucket, but we haven't really touched on the bucket where there are some teachers that you might encounter that have some affiliation with.
Yeah, and sorry, just one point on that. So, and a very important point about the fake non-secular teachers, Buddhist teachers, and why this chapter is more about that is because Lama Jampa in the book talks about, we give them the power through our credulity. We believe in them as some kind of savior. You can't really do that with the secular teachers, the mindfulness teachers, because they're not pretending to be anything other than completely worldly, very minor benefits to doing this thing. And so you're not going to kind of give your life over to them, give them a kind of control over you, because they're just not offering you that much. They're offering you some very minor things, and it's big business and whatnot, but it's not all consuming. Whereas what this chapter is about, I think, is much more, the second bucket, which is the spiritual bucket, where you come in with this credulity, this naivety, and this projection, and you say, yeah, this person is going to save me.
Yeah.
Give them
And I mean, you see it sometimes. You do meet people who, you know, maybe there's a visiting lama, like a well-known lama, and you get people flying in for it. And you do see these people sort of really overzealous and it's like, it's a bit like they approach it like a Christian worships Jesus. And like, this is their new Jesus or their new God. And it's really quite often quite over emotional.
Well, I mean, it's not negative until well, I'm not sure at what point it becomes negative, but you know, it is quite traditional for a genuine teacher-student relationship to have that devotion, right? That's
yeah. I was going to say that in itself isn't necessarily a bad thing. I don't think having a strong reaction or feeling very, you know, like even overzealous about your teacher isn't necessarily a bad thing. It's whether the teacher is authentic. It's whether you're investing all of that in, and you haven't really done the groundwork to figure out whether this is somebody worth investing that level of commitment to. And then
sorry.
No, go ahead.
And then it turns into resentment. That's the point. I mean, but yes, the resentment, that's when it becomes a problem, is when the resentment kicks in.
I think the other thing about the credulity thing is a few defense mechanisms we miss as Westerners approaching it, isn't it? I think you're right, isn't it? Maybe being devoted is certainly a traditional thing as well, but who are you being devoted to? And like, for us as Westerners, it's very difficult to discern a good, authentic or inauthentic teacher, and we don't know much Dharma, so it makes us even more vulnerable. And like in the Tibetan community, for example, I think, you know, they would often gossip about teachers and what they've been up to or alleged to be up to, and who's good and who isn't, and there'll be a whole sort of, you know, sub discussion going on so people could sort of suss things out. Whereas for Westerners, we don't really have that.
But then we have common sense, though. I mean, like you see, okay, so I'm a traditional, I affiliate myself with a traditional Tibetan Buddhist lineage. I've been on a historic 3-year retreat, and you know, so I'm totally recognized by one of the four heads of the Tibetan, you know, Buddhist traditions. But I also want to sell you this, which is very compelling, Dr. Norin's elixir. And so, like, all you have to do is take like a few drops of this every day, and it will get rid of like all of your sicknesses, and it will help just kind of facilitate your path to enlightenment. And if you want to come on a little vacation type retreat, pretty easy going with me, then you know, for a couple $1,000, then you know, you can do that. Subscribe to my website and rock and roll.
If only it was so obvious, isn't it? If only it was so obvious. Because a lot of it, like the retreat thing, what Lama doesn't have some sort of retreats that they facilitate or lead, and they don't always sell medicinal products like that.
Yeah, no.
It's quite tricky, isn't it?
It is, but if you dig deep enough, like, all right, so there are some basic ground rules, aren't there? I mean, yeah, like if you're looking at a teacher, they have to be affiliated with a lineage of some kind that's authentic, that you can trace back, and that they've been somehow been granted permission to teach by their teacher. You know, you have to be able to track it back, and then that immediately excludes quite a lot of people who claim to be authentic Buddhists, because you know, you can do the research and find people that have been
yeah, that's definitely one good one, but it doesn't get rid of everyone.
Doesn't,
yeah,
no.
But to your point, yeah, they should say who is their main lama. That lama should have given them authority in some way. But like it says in 50 verses, if your lama, you know, is dead, then that creates something. And then I've seen actively, you know, some of these pseudo Western lamas, what they do is they look for photo opportunities with great teachers. And you'll find them on their website, and you'll find them referencing them, and they're a student. They've even sometimes, I've known, have been successful in inviting some of the really authentic great lamas to their centers, and they've come and given them that sort of authority, and then later has come out that actually they weren't all that.
Also now, Buddhism's been in the West long enough where you've got fake teachers appointing fake teachers. So it's not enough just to say my teacher appointed me. And they've even got the titles, as it also mentions in the book. But I mean, Shantideva says in the Bodhisattva they need to have knowledge of the scriptures, and they need to be able to keep their vows. That's a very good couple of things right there, because most of these fake teachers don't know anything about the teachings.
Yeah, which I think is why the book, isn't it? It says like the main antidote, therefore, is you need to know some Dharma, like anything that talks about the four thoughts, turn mind to Dharma. And also, like I say, it talks about vows and pleasures. A lot of new people, though, won't know those things at all. But yeah, that's part of the problem, isn't it? They don't actually know what the vows are. But as a rule of thumb, you can say the teacher has to keep moral conduct. And even if you don't know what moral conduct is in detail, because that's also, you can use your common sense, which is they're not harming people. That's the essence of all moral conduct in the Dharma, is not harming others. So you have to really look at it and say, are any of their students being harmed by them in some way? And have a very sober look at their current students. Yeah, there's some grey areas, aren't there? Like, because also, like, not all lamas have taken one monastic vow, so may not be a monk or nun, so therefore they may be a lay person. Then as a lay person, they can take the 5 pratimoksha vows, but they don't necessarily have to have taken them all. So you're right, the core one's not to harm others, isn't it? It's the minimum. So, but then you get a teacher like Trungpa who's like drugged up, drunk, debauchery.
Yeah, but maybe in his case, if you applied that test, he probably wouldn't pass it, right? And so you wouldn't be making a mistake to move on and look for someone else.
I mean, right? there is already an acid test that exists for finding and whether a teacher is legit or not. And I mean, and let's say you narrow things down, you're interested in Tibetan Buddhism, and you're looking at maybe Sakya and Kaji, then you can apply Sachin Kunga Nyingpo's parting from the 4 attachments, and you can look at those things and look at the teacher from those things. Is he or she a person of this life? And do a little bit of research, and it might raise some red flags, or it might encourage you to proceed. I mean, that's mentioned in this chapter on disillusionment.
I think I might be wrong, but strictly speaking, I think that's mentioned in the context of something to apply to yourself when testing. Are you going in with the right motivation?
It is. You're right, but you could apply it in the same context towards a teacher. If you want to be discriminating, I mean, and that again would get rid of a lot of the fake teachers just by looking at that and using your common sense. Are they a person of this life? Are they like trying to make some kind of financial gain out of?
True, but that's not enough. They've got to know something about the scriptures, and they've got to keep their vows. They've got to do that. Otherwise, they're not a teacher. They might just be a good person. They might not even be that, of course, but they've got to know something about the scriptures, and that rules out most people. They've got to keep their vows, and that.
But I think you're both right, isn't it? You're both right, but it's often they do know some Dharma. I mean, that's the thing, isn't it? The fake ones often do know Dharma. I think. Well, but Paul's right. If your own motivation's right, it's more you can spot when someone's trying to play to ego and say, stuff inconsistent with like the Jumpa Zijral, then it helps you spot when you say what you're saying doesn't agree with this teaching. So you both, so it shows scripturally they're sort of going off base. You're motivated, so you've actually made the effort to understand what the Jumpa Zijral is and what it's about, and that helps you then judge the teacher and spot a fake one.
One thing I found confusing is that this point that everything rests on the point of intention, because that is so easy to be misinterpreted. Because you could apply that to Trungpa and say, all right, he had a pretty radical approach, like you say, to drugs. He was very affected by the Western culture, I think. And yet you could also argue that his intention was compassionate. He was trying to find a way to bring the Buddhist teachings to the West and just trying to navigate a route to do that. And so, I mean, what is it? We say the road to hell is paved with good intentions, where you can have the best of intentions and you can still.
Yeah, but that's not, that line about the importance of intention is not for you to judge anyone else. Quite the opposite. You can you're only aware of your own intentions. So that's another way of, perhaps we should talk about and move on from the teachers, because there's a whole, the next section really is about your internal attitude.
Yeah.
Maybe just before we wrap up on teachers though, one point to make is in the book is that, there's always been good and bad teachers. And that's it. Sometimes people just assume, oh, the brown-skinned Tibetan got a title, they're going to be good. But whereas a Tibetan would know that doesn't mean they are a good teacher. So that's one. So knowing a bit about this history of Buddhism, really, there's always been good and bad teachers out there.
Yeah, right back to the time of the Buddha. And it's actually a bit of an exaggeration to say that it's a bit of an exaggeration to say that the Tibetans were very good at discriminating good teachers from bad teachers. Like there's a lot of stories about the fake teachers who'd come up and get a massive following. It was more the scholars and wise people like Sakya Pandita who had to really take action and explain this is not consistent with the teaching. This person may be a good person, but it's not Buddhism. So I'm not sure that Tibetans were intrinsically better able to discriminate without the help of wise people.
Yeah, and I think another point about them coming to the West as well is that you're looking at a culture that's been completely displaced, and the normal mechanisms by which a teacher would be supported, like financially and so on, have disappeared. So often teachers may be looking for students and looking for jindaks, people to support them financially, and obviously a Westerner coming to it may not be conscious of that backdrop. And when they encounter a teacher, that's more gullible.
That's the credulity point, going in with credulity, and that's something that can be easily corrected. It's just by applying your normal common sense that you would apply to normal things. But unfortunately, not enough people know that. They don't know how dangerous. They don't know what a minefield it is out there. And we were lucky. When I look back at my own entry into Buddhism, I could have easily stepped on a mine and just gone off in the wrong direction completely. I was just lucky, really. But yeah, on the fakes, it's so interesting that not only there's many examples from Tibet, but it really goes back to the time of the Buddha himself and his cousin, I think it was his cousin, Devadatta, who stalked him, as it says, and followed him everywhere, and was constantly saying, "No, I'm better than him. I can do this, this, and this," and actually had some spiritual powers. And fooled a lot of people, and that's in the sutras. So many stories about Devadatta. It's very interesting that it's really built into the Buddhist scriptures.
We're talking about real disillusionment, I think, is what we need to clarify. So we talked about the disillusionment that you might experience if you encounter some kind of fake form of the Dharma, but disillusionment has another aspect which is actually quite separate, and it leads to renunciation. And it's more than just like a disappointment with things. Like you could be disappointed with the state of the world right now. But you're not going to be disillusioned with it. In terms of disillusionment implies that you've been so disgusted by something that you're done. You're going to completely renounce it, and that's really what I feel like disillusionment leads to. And
and it's difficult, isn't it? Lama Jampa talks about the four thoughts that turn the mind to Dharma, which is traditionally the main teachings where you develop that sense of renunciation and disillusionment, that analytical meditation. And we haven't got time to talk through that or go through the detail, but he also then references, if you do have that renunciation, then we also give up the 8 worldly dharmas. And I think that's in some ways a key point, isn't it? That if we approach things with the 8 worldly dharmas, then we can easily be led astray. And the 8 worldly dharmas, again, I can't go in detail, isn't it? But it's things like, you know, the pursuit of pleasure and avoiding pain, or the pursuit of gain, you know, getting stuff and avoiding losing the stuff you got, or seeking fame and avoiding
notoriety.
And it's so funny, isn't it? Like all of us, even even if you're practicing, it's so easy. You know, many of our motivations are also caught up in those things. It's really hard to really, you know, over time, I guess you try to catch yourself, but rooting that stuff out. I think Lama says that's the sort of that real disillusionment, giving up the eight-worldly dharmas. That's sort of the protection to, was it credulity and so on.
Yeah, right. So it's not like you take refuge and become a Buddhist on one day, and then the next moment you've totally abandoned the eight worldly dharmas, or even 20 years later, like you said, you know, you're constantly just holding up those things as a mirror, the teachings as a mirror of like, am I actually really living my life as a Buddhist? Am I trying to analyze my behavior and look at it and then that through that lens, or am I just checking a box and, you know, turning up occasionally to pujas, but not really doing anything like that?
Yeah, I mean, you look at like the lives of the early Kagyu lamas, the Tibetan ones, you know, Marpa, Milarepa, and Gampopa, and they all their lives had deep tragedy. And you know, Marpa's son died in a horse riding accident. Milarepa's mother, I mean, his whole family was dispossessed of their inheritance and basically put into domestic slavery. And his mother died of that. And you know, his whole story is one of absolute tragedy and just horror and disgust at the state of the world. And Gampopa's whole family was killed in either a flood or an earthquake. I think there's both accounts exist, but they died before he you know, became a monk. And his response to that was to become a monk. And that level of personal sadness and tragedy is so almost unimaginable compared to, you know, what our day to day, when you're not thinking about those things. And our whole approach to Buddhism is so often, well, you know, I'll just talk to myself, you know, sort of trivial and a bit frivolous and silly. But then sometimes tragedy touches you, and then it's a question. Then that's a test. Then, like, can I turn to the Dharma now and you know, get some help from it, or is it just useless because the tragedy is so deep, but my connection with the Dharma was so shallow that there's nothing for me. You can't deceive yourself when that level, when, you know, someone you love dies. You can't deceive yourself at all as to what you need to depend on. You know.
So you raise an interesting point there as well about, you know, precious human birth and suffering. In a way, it's a bit like, it does feel a bit like you need enough suffering in your life to want to practice Dharma, to be looking for something that gives you that stability, a recognition that life is filled with tragedy and suffering. So that's one of the paradoxes, isn't it, in Buddhism, is that in a way, though you don't seek it out, you know, stuff happens and we suffer, and that's sort of fuel for the path in a way, isn't it? That's what helps us really engage with the Dharma, make it real, and then to your point, then when we encounter difficulties in the future, then it makes, you know, that's hopefully if we take it seriously, then it's there for us and helps us get through it.
Yeah, it's a really interesting point you make about the tragedy being a trigger for entry into the Dharma, because everyone at some point is going to encounter something that makes them really wonder, question what they're doing, where they're going, and whether, like, just how they're addressing seeking happiness. At some point, you know, as a human being, you're going to question that. Even if you're not particularly spiritually inclined or religiously inclined, you're going to come up against a tragedy. Someone you're close to is going to die. Someone you're close to is going to get sick. You might get sick, you know. And then you really have to question, well, what have I been doing up till now? And has it really made any impact? You know, where's it going? And you come to this kind of cathartic junction or fork in your life where you can make a decision, and there's this openness in that area, and there's a lot of openness and good qualities that come from tragedy and suffering.
I really love this passage towards the end of the chapter about having it's quite abstract, but perhaps it's about having been in the Dharma for a while and having gone in with good intentions, but with a bit of naivety and credulity, and with all of our flaws. And he says, once we were young and full of the promise of summer. Unfortunately, we took so many shortcuts and made so many wrong turns that we're no longer sure how we arrived here or exactly what it was that we came here to get away from. Sometimes it's so dark that we don't even know what the word hope means anymore. When we look back, we can see that we meant well, but somehow it never turned out the way we intended. There were so many people we promised to help, but we only ended up helping ourselves. There were so many times we swore we'd be true, but we were true only to our own ambition. The summer of enlightenment is a distant dream, and our cold winter is promising to be hard. And I really love that passage because it's very poetic, but it really encapsulates the disillusionment of when you go into Dharma. We were all young when we got into Dharma, and it was a bit of a summer of credulity, and here we are now getting old, and and I also think, just one more point on that, I often think about, I was reading recently this biography of Kama Champa, who's a great Kagyu master, being in retreat and how cold it was in his cave. And those great Kagyu masters, the retreat masters from any tradition who meditate in caves, you can't sit there in the freezing cold in the land of snows, Tibet, in a cave, eating just enough food to stay alive and just enough clothes to not freeze to death, without a very, very, very serious renunciation and disillusionment with fakery. So. Yeah,
that's a really good passage and point. And it when I hear it, it makes me think that you come up with that level of kind of, all right, everything I've been doing up until now hasn't worked out for me. You have to start taking responsibility for your actions and not looking at somebody else to fix it for you, but you have to make some really hard choices about maybe everything I've done up until this point hasn't really, worked out for me, and I need to radically rethink the direction I'm heading in, and
Yeah, and just also having been in the Dharma for a while, all of those sort of what's the word, encrustations or something, the calcification of perhaps what were good intentions, and then looking back after a long period of time and seeing really only failure, maybe glimmers of hope here and there, but mainly just wasted time.
But it's context. It's all about context as well, because it's like those failures, all of that disgust and disappointment isn't necessarily, if you bring it onto the path, it can be a great source of like motivation. If you it's like when you bring to mind that level of pain, like when you're really hurt, it's easy to remember that. If like, oh, I really remember that one incident because it was so painful to me. And then you can keep drawing it to mind to help you develop a commitment to never do that again. It's like a confession or renunciation has that level of you have to be completely disgusted with something to really push it away. Otherwise, why bother? Like if you're not disgusted with it, if you haven't experienced some tragedy, then you're not really going to be compelled to like renounce it.
You raise a number of good points there. I was just trying to. One thing, isn't it, is when you first approach Dharma, we do have a sort of, like you say, naivety, isn't it? And I think, certainly when I encountered it, and you hear about Vajrayana being the quick path, so I thought, I'm going to read pretty quick. And then, like I say, over the years, it's a bit like, you recognize actually it's going to take longer than I thought, and then it's like, and then more. It's a bit like, maybe just me, but it's a bit like you approach it as a Westerner, maybe, a bit like you approach ideals in a way, and now you've got your ideal of enlightenment in a way, and it's a big idea, and it's wow, this amazing, and I've got to get there. And then over time, you realize it's actually the way you train is got to be you're sort of beaten down a little bit, and it's a bit like because every day, you know, these little things every day which I brushed over, like getting irritated with someone and saying something rude or, you know, impatient. Those are little things actually that make the big difference, isn't it, on the path? And so in a way, it sort of grounds you from this, like it's like some new ideal sort of thing to being actually the path is actually the nitty gritty of the little things every day. That's sort of the food for our practice, and then every day, you know, start again. Well, end of day, confess everything, start again every day, and try and do a little bit of good. But yeah.
Well, one other point towards the end of the chapter, he says about renunciation, giving you a clarity about the modern world, and he talks about how much is broken in the modern world. You know, politicians break their promises, people break their marriage vows. Everywhere that everything seems broken. But then he points to the fact that really the source of this is not really a fault in the external world. We're broken on the inside. And then he talks about the being like a monkey, like we're so distracted. But this thing about modern world is it's actually worse in the modern world because there's so much opportunity for distraction and just jumping from one thing to the next thing. So if you're not happy with something, the world promises you can just jump onto something else that may interest you. And of course, you know, social media is the classic example of this.
Yeah. Well, one thing, and we're trying to round up, but one thing I want to make clear is that we talked about this whole chapter on disillusionment really leads into, I think, taking refuge and embarking on the path, if that's something, a conclusion that you reach. But it's important to make the distinction that, you know, we have Buddha nature, but we're not taking refuge in ourself. We're taking refuge in a teacher that we've recognized is someone who has more wisdom than us. And that's a very important distinction to make, is that we use our ability to reason and to, you know, filter out the fakes and the snake oil to find a legitimate teacher. But once we've found that legitimate teacher, we're taking refuge in them. We're taking refuge in something, you know, other than ourselves. Although as you progress in the path, you realize the inseparability of those two things. But initially, you have to kind of reject that you're not taking refuge in yourself anymore. It's not about me. And that's quite an important distinction to make. We've relied on our ability to reason to get to a certain level. We've become disillusioned and disgusted with the world. And because we've exclusively taken refuge in ourselves up until this point, we've solely relied on our own judgment, and it's led us nowhere. It's led us to this point of complete disgust and disillusionment with ourselves. And that's a good thing if we can then find someone with wisdom to guide us towards something else.
In short, we've got a bad case of the disease of conceit in the West as Western Buddhists. We think that Buddhism is something that's simply in agreement with our pre-existing opinions. And that way lies terrible disillusionment.
And I think related to that is the talk about vows and pledges, isn't it? So, which is sort of connected to the Lama, but also connected with this environment we're in, where the world promises, you know, happiness and pleasure here, there, wherever, and everyone's just caught up in distraction. And you know, vows and pleasure. You know, how do you get some stability in this world where our minds are just pulled in every direction, offering us what we want? And to your point, isn't it? I think, you know, if you take refuge with the Lama, but taking refuge in the three jewels and the vows and pledges and the sort of stability that can give you then. So, you know, take refuge in the Buddha and not in other worldly gods, take refuge in the Dharma, not harming beings, and take refuge in Sangha, not looking for other, you know, take refuge in other communities and so on. That, I mean, vows and pledges, it's not very fashionable, isn't it? But for me, you know, I was, from Lama Jampa, I guess I was taught to take them seriously from the get-go, and yeah, have taken pretty seriously, make lots of mistakes, infringements, day to day, but take them really seriously, try, to keep them. And that is so grounding and so powerful. And it's sort of one of the main antidotes I think we need in this day and age.
Yeah, I completely agree. It's something that, it's not fashionable, as you say. It's not even not fashionable. It's almost, where are vows kept these days? They're somewhat excluded from the modern world completely. Like, what is the point of the marriage vow these days exactly? If it's just expected you're not supposed to keep it. And politicians is another good example. They take these pledges, don't they? I pledge to do this, this, and this, and then they never ever do any of it. Or, do the opposite. So I agree. Like, the vows are this almost magical spell that you just by keeping them. Of course, it's very difficult to keep them, but if you can, its power is almost unimaginable, because the idea of a vow is unimaginable to most people. The idea of keeping a vow and actually keeping it is almost unimaginable in the modern world. It's interesting because this chapter is a sort of pivot point where it goes from the disillusionment with the fake dharma and your own projections to actual real proper disillusionment with the world and with samsara. And from here on, the text also is sort of more interior and showing the dharma.
Yeah.
But we do have a plan for our viewers who are concerned that we may be nearing the end of Wisdom in Exile, which we are. We do have a plan of sorts, so we're not going to stop just yet.
Even once we complete the book, we're hoping that we'll be able to continue the podcast and discuss other elements of Buddhism and keep things going.
Can we do like Wisdom in Exile?
So here we are. Yeah. All right. So here we are at the end of chapter 6, Disillusionment. We hope you stayed with us for this fun and enjoyable ride through the wild swamps of samsara. And next podcast, we'll be moving on to learning the craft. Paul and Adrian, do you have any finishing comments to make before we wrap up?
No, I thought you did it perfectly. So yeah, I'll give me a couple of syringes of the good stuff, and I'll inject that straight away.
And he says, there won't be any money. But when you die, on your deathbed, you will receive total consciousness. So I got that going for me, which is nice.